Before we begin, remember this. When Sultan Mehmed II marched toward Wallachia, he expected resistance, but nothing prepared him for what Vlad left waiting on the road. Imagine this. Scouts ride ahead, and the horses suddenly stop. The men refuse to move, because in front of them is not a battlefield. It's a message. A message built from thousands of Ottoman prisoners, arranged so precisely that even today historians can't agree how Vlad had time to construct it. And here's the strangest part. Inside that forest of bodies, Ottoman officers recognized faces they knew, prisoners who had been alive just days before. But what Vlad did to them and why he targeted those specific men has been debated for nearly 600 years. In the next minutes, you're going to see the truth behind the most calculated horrors Vlad the Impaler ever committed, including the one-act Ottoman chroniclers begged future scribes never to write down. And yes, we will get to that moment. But to understand it, we must begin long before the first stake was ever placed in the ground. Imagine marching toward a capital and, as the sun lifts off the plain, being met not by trees but by a forest of human bodies. Stakes rise in ordered rows along the road. Turbans caught on wood flutter in the wind like flags. Birds circle above. The air is thick with the sour tang of blood and something fouler still, fear given form. Men who had crossed continents with banners and drums find themselves reduced to a message nailed into the ground. Look what happens to those who cross this Lord. That is the image the title promises. The most horrible acts Vlad the Impaler committed against Ottoman prisoners. And it is where this account begins. Not as mere spectacle, but as deliberate communication. A statecraft of cruelty, engineered to be read at a glance and felt in the gut. This is not random savagery. It is terror as technology. To understand how and why these particular horrors were directed at Ottoman captives, it helps to step back to the young man who would wield them. The story of Vlad III is, at its root, a story of apprenticeship. An apprenticeship in humiliation, in survival, and in the instruments of fear. When Vlad was a boy, he spent years as a political hostage at the Ottoman court. Contemporary records place him there from roughly early adolescence into his late teens, a period during which he was both a captive and a student of power. The exact details of his day-to-day life in Adrianople or Constantinople are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Ottoman chronicles and Wallachian or Hungarian letters describe different small scenes. What is not in doubt is the context. A Christian prince's son living under the shadow of an imperial capital that used spectacle and punishment as tools of rule. He observed public executions, the rituals of submission, the language of power performed through violence. He learned Ottoman Turkish and absorbed enough of the court's methods to later deploy a reflection of them on his own soil. This formative exposure matters. Trauma and political calculation interacted. Being a hostage meant more than personal humiliation. It taught Vlad the communicative power of pain. It taught him that terror could be translated into obedience or into deterrence. In the years after his return to Wallachia, when the precariousness of his rule would push him to choose means that were as theatrical as they were brutal, those lessons would be evident. But the link between childhood captivity and later cruelty is not a simple line from victim to monster. Scholars debate degrees and motivations. Some historians emphasize Vlad's political precariousness, a ruler squeezed between much larger powers, surrounded by treacherous boyars, facing Ottoman incursions that threatened his realm, and interpret his actions as desperate attempts at state survival. Other analysts place more weight on psychological factors, seeing in Vlad a figure whose early exposure to humiliation and spectacle inclined him toward punitive performance. The sources themselves are partisan. Ottoman accounts have framed him as a barbarian to justify campaigns. Hungarian and Saxon pamphlets circulated in Central Europe amplified his cruelty, sometimes with clear propagandistic intent. Where possible, the narrative below will flag those biases. One pattern stands out across accounts. When Vlad's brutality is directed outward at Ottoman soldiers and envoys, it is seldom random. Instead, it is staged, symbolic, and communicative. The acts against Ottoman captives were designed to be seen, to be read, and, crucially, to be felt by the enemy as a message to their leaders. The methods he used were not inventions of instinct alone. They were calculated performances. Take, for example, a recurrent claim in contemporary European pamphlets and chronicles, the nailing of turbans to the heads of Ottoman envoys. According to German-language pamphlets circulated among Saxon merchants and townspeople, Vlad would take the distinctive headgear of Ottoman opponents, items that signaled identity, rank, and religious belonging, and affix them firmly to their skulls, so that the enemy's own insignia became part of the spectacle of punishment. These accounts are emphatic in their symbolism. By fastening the turban to its wearer, the act was not merely killing, it was a message carried back in horror to the Sublime Porte. Yet such reports must be contextualized. Saxon pamphlets were produced in a political environment eager for sensational stories. German and other Western European printers fed a market that relished tales of the exotic and the monstrous in the East. Ottoman chronicles, conversely, often minimize the scale of such mutilations or focus on the shame inflicted upon their commanders rather than the grisly details. Modern historians tend to accept that mutilations targeting symbols, turbans, flags, badges, did occur, but caution against treating numbers or the most lurid anecdotes as straightforward facts. Where the pamphlets provide vivid description, scholars ask whether those details served more as propaganda than precise reportage. Even with that caveat, the symbolic logic is plain. A turban nailed to a head is not only mutilation, it is a message. I can humiliate your identity and send that humiliation home with those who survive. When the target is an envoy rather than a frontline soldier, the communicative intent sharpens. Envoys are meant to speak for a sovereign. To mutilate an envoy is to insult the sovereign's person, to puncture not merely flesh but authority. Another category of act, more central to Vlad's reputation, involves impalement, slow, public executions designed to maximize visibility and dread. Impalement had precedence in the region and was known in several Near Eastern and Eastern European contexts. What Vlad is most often credited with, and what European blonde ink pamphlets and some Ottoman chroniclers emphasize, was the systematization of this punishment into a staged, almost architectural display. Contemporary accounts describe lines and clusters of stakes positioned along roads, at city gates, and on hillsides, where they would be visible to approaching forces. The victims were not always arranged at random. Reports suggest planned arrays designed for maximum psychological effect. Ranks of stakes by the roadside, groups forming patterns that could be perceived from a distance, and, in some accounts, tiers or hierarchies of placement to signify rank among the impaled. Careful language is necessary here. Primary sources vary wildly in their specificity and reliability. Some Eastern chroniclers give terse mentions. Western pamphlets offer dramatic tableau and numbers that are often suspect. Modern historians, relying on cross-examination of these documents, tend to avoid precise counts and emphasize intent over tally. It is likely that impalement was used repeatedly and publicly. It is less certain how many were impaled at any one time, or whether every depiction in pamphlets corresponds to a verifiable event rather than rhetorical flourish. When reconstructing the technique, scholars highlight several recurring elements reported across sources. Stakes used for impalement were often tall and placed at slight angles to prolong suffering without immediate collapse. The act was not always the quick insertion often imagined in modern fiction. Instead, it was sometimes engineered to be extended, to keep the victim conscious for longer so the display could be fully witnessed. Accounts stress that those impaled were left in place for days or weeks, a living signpost. Chroniclers emphasize the psychological calculus. A soldier who survives such an ordeal only to be placed where his body is visible for others, that body becomes an emissary of terror. Again, a note of caution.
Contemporary narratives sometimes describe the technicalities of impalement with a level of detail that likely served rhetorical ends. The intent of many pamphleteers was to shock. The intent of state chroniclers was to moralize. Historians have learned to read between those rhetorical layers. Still, the repeated pattern, deliberate selection of place, arrangement for visibility, and aim to prolong awareness of the punishment, is supported by multiple independent attestations and aligns with a strategy of psychological warfare. There are specific episodes where the targets were unquestionably linked to Ottoman operations. Some accounts identify captured Ottoman commanders who were displayed as messages to Sultan Mehmed II. One name that appears in certain chronicles is Hamza Pasha, an Ottoman commander active in the Danubian campaigns. Some European narratives claim Hamza Pasha was captured and impaled. Ottoman sources and later historians are more circumspect, offering different readings or questioning the identification. What is clear, given the strategic logic, is that displaying a captured commander, alive or dead, intact or mutilated, would aim a direct insult at the chain of command and would be read by both troops and opposing leaders as a challenge. Beyond impalement and the nailing of turbans, other acts described by contemporaries suggest a palette of symbolic cruelties. Prisoners were allegedly kept alive for extended periods not only to be impaled, but to be paraded or placed where they could be seen by approaching forces. The accounts indicate that Vlad sometimes set up displays in which prisoners occupied positions that made them impossible to ignore. Along the road the army would travel, on the heights around the capital, or in front of the gates, so that any envoy or soldier arriving would confront the spectacle immediately. In some narratives, the height of stakes was used to denote the rank of the prisoner. Commanders were given prominent placement, common soldiers arranged in mass. This hierarchy in display speaks to a theatrical understanding of terror, not only to punish, but to communicate a social message about order and consequence. One of the more notorious claims found in foreign pamphlets, and one that the modern scholarship treats with caution, is the image of Vlad dining among his impaled victims. It is one of those anecdotes that borders between the demonstrable and the propagandistic. Sources that wish to paint him as monstrous seize upon it. Other records either omit it or suggest exaggeration. When evaluating such reports, historians raise the possibility of two layers of interpretation. On one hand, the scene of a ruler dining in the shadow of his victims, if true, would be a striking performative act, an assertion that the ruler was untroubled by the suffering he inflicted, using conviviality as a contrast to amplify terror. On the other hand, the anecdote plays into a familiar motif in demonizing rhetoric, the monstrous tyrant who eats while others suffer, and could have been amplified or constructed by enemies to delegitimize him. Evidence for the dining episodes comes primarily from Western pamphlets and later Latin chronicles. Ottoman records and local administrative documents do not corroborate that specific tableau in the same sensational terms. Thus, it should be treated as a contested motif, evocative, possibly rooted in a kernel of truth, but amplified in retelling. What unites the various acts, turbans nailed to skulls, arranged forests of impaled captives, accused commanders displayed publicly, and the more lurid anecdotes, is a consistent communicative purpose. These were not private acts of vengeance, they were state messages. Vlad's choice to direct much of this cruelty at Ottoman prisoners must be seen through the lens of asymmetric warfare and the psychology of deterrence. Wallachia, a small principality squeezed between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, faced a strategic dilemma. Its military resources were limited. Its aristocracy, the boyars, often had loyalties that could turn with the wind. In this precarious environment, ordinary battlefield victory was uncertain. What Vlad appears to have sought, and what his displays produced, was a different kind of victory. The intimidation of an opponent so profound that the opponent would hesitate to press their numerical or logistical advantages. The scale and theatricality of the punishments were meant to be a force multiplier. If an army cannot risk advancing into territory where each road might lead to a tableau of impalement, then the defender's shortage of men is partially offset by the psychological cost imposed on the attacker. That calculation helps explain the targeted cruelty against Ottoman prisoners. Ottoman forces operated with a highly organized chain of command and a strong symbolic center in the person of Mehmed II. To humiliate or display the prisoners of that army was to speak directly to that command structure and to its morale. It is one thing to kill an enemy in the field. It is another to take members of his army and transform them into a mobile bulletin board announcing who would suffer if the invader persisted. Contemporary reactions reflect the intended effect. Chroniclers of various stripes recorded moments when Ottoman contingents encountered Vlad's displays: stunned silence, desertion, and, in some stories, physical sickness. Ottoman chroniclers describe the horror and astonishment among some soldiers upon seeing the impaled. Western and Central European pamphlets revel in the panic such spectacles supposedly inspired.
Modern scholars argue over dramatic specifics, whether entire columns withdrew, whether Mehmed himself witnessed certain arrays, but the convergence of independent accounts on the psychological impact lends weight to the idea that the displays achieved at least partial strategic success. The staging mattered. Reports indicate that impalements were placed along main approaches to the capital and along routes commonly used by travelers and envoys. The choice of visible locations was not accidental. It maximized the probability that the Ottoman army, advancing through the same terrain, would encounter the scene. The arrangements, aligned stakes, grouped by rank, placed near gates and plinths, spoke in the language of theater. This was not merely punitive. It was a message intended to travel quickly and intact. But how did such brutality fit with other elements of Vlad's military strategy? The acts against prisoners did not occur in isolation. They complemented a broader set of tactics: scorched earth measures that denied invaders supplies, guerrilla-style night raids that harried and undermined logistical coherence, and targeted strikes that aimed to break the cohesion of larger forces. The displays of impaled captives were part of an integrated approach. If you could slow an invading army's advance by making each mile more psychologically costly, if you could undermine discipline with fear and revulsion, and if you could complicate supply lines by burning provisions, then a smaller, more mobile defense force might force a larger army to retreat or stall. It was not merely about deterring troops on the march. The spectacle sent a message to the Sultan himself. Mehmed II was not merely a distant authority. He was a claimant to the title of conqueror and a figure whose prestige depended on projecting control. A captured or mutilated commander, or a road festooned with the bodies of his soldiers, was an affront to imperial dignity. Whether that affront would be punished with full retribution was another question, one that weighed on the calculations of both sides. For Vlad, the calculation may have been that producing humiliation at any cost would impose a political cost on the Sultan, forcing him to reconsider the value of an extended or embittered campaign in the region. At this stage, it is necessary to reiterate the scholarly caution. Sources are uneven. Ottoman archives focus on campaigns and outcomes, sometimes downplaying embarrassing details. Wallachian and Hungarian sources can emphasize resistance and valor. Saxon pamphlets trade in sensation. When they converge on the existence of staged impalements and symbolic mutilation, historians take notice. When they diverge on numbers or on specific identities of the impaled, scholars raise a question mark. Where a single chronicler offers a lurid tale absent from other contemporary accounts, modern readers are right to suspect embellishment. Even with methodological prudence, certain concrete episodes are repeatedly mentioned across independent texts. There are multiple references to large-scale displays set along the approaches to Targovishte, the Wallachian capital, timed to greet an advancing Ottoman column. There are repeated, if variably attested, claims that commanders captured in raids were publicly displayed. And there are recurring mentions of symbolic mutilation, turbans and other signs of identity used as instruments of shame. These patterns suggest deliberate, repeated practice rather than a single, isolated lapse into cruelty. If the acts against Ottoman prisoners were meant as messages, who precisely were they addressed to? First, to the soldiers and commanders in the field, to erode morale, to seed desertion, to make the cost of advance visible and unbearable. Second, to the Sultan's court and the broader Ottoman polity, to humiliate, to force negotiation, or at least to complicate the calculus of conquest. Third, to the local population and the boyars, to demonstrate authority and the lengths to which the prince would go to maintain order or punish treachery. The public dimension of the punishments meant that they functioned simultaneously as foreign policy, domestic discipline, and theater. Even so, there is a moral arithmetic that needs to be confronted. Terror works. It also corrodes. The same acts that might deter an invading force can harden internal opposition, alienate potential allies, and furnish enemies with ammunition for delegitimization. Vlad's use of cruelty, particularly directed at prisoners who carried identifiable political status in the Ottoman military system, achieved the kind of immediate effect a desperate ruler might prize. But it also seeded memory, and not the benign kind. Chronicles, pamphlets, and later cultural retellings would freeze those images into legend. The medieval printing presses that spread accounts of Vlad's brutality, the Ottoman annals that recorded affront and loss, and the centuries of retelling that followed would turn specific historical practices into archetypes of monstrous rule. This interplay of immediate tactical gain and long-term reputational cost is central to the story of Vlad's acts against Ottoman prisoners. It is not enough to catalog the cruelties. One must also register their strategic function and their cost. For now, having sketched the mental and political background and having outlined the sorts of acts reported by contemporaries, the next step is to examine particular instances and the documentary traces that record them, always with care about provenance and bias. Here is the first such example. Several Central European pamphlets circulating in the 15th century recount an episode in which Ottoman envoys sent to negotiate or to demand tribute were treated not only as prisoners but as objects of theatrical humiliation. The accounts claim that their turbans, a conspicuous marker of status and faith, were fastened to their heads on stakes and then displayed where the Sultan's eyes might metaphorically fall. These narratives are emphatic in sensory detail. The heavy fabric, pinned fast, the tassels caught by wind. The purpose, the pamphlets insist, was deliberate insult. Modern historians generally accept that humiliation targeting signifiers of identity was a feature of the violence at the time. But they caution that the particular anecdote's most lurid details likely bear the imprint of pamphleteers eager for shock value. A second, more documented pattern involves the capture of Ottoman officers during raids and their subsequent public display. Contemporary military correspondence and some Ottoman notes refer to surprise attacks and the capture of small detachments. In at least one instance, later chroniclers specifically name a commander, variously rendered in Western accounts as Hamza Pasha, as a figure whose fate was used for maximum symbolic effect. The plurality of sources on the capture of officers lends credibility to the claim that high-ranking prisoners were singled out for public humiliation. The exact nature of their display, however, is contested. Some sources suggest execution by impalement. Others offer less sensational descriptions. Still, the strategic calculus is consistent. Taking and displaying commanders was intended to shame the Ottoman chain of command and to signal the price of intrusion. A third recurring pattern relates to the very architecture of the impalement, the forest. Multiple independent sources describe concentrations of impaled victims aligned along roads and around the capital in numbers sufficient to form an unmistakable, terrifying landscape. These descriptions, repeated in both Western and Ottoman-oriented texts, vary in scale and tone but align on a common effect. The advancing soldier would be confronted with a deliberate, visible proof of the costs of invasion.
Modern historians caution against accepting precise figures offered by early pamphlets. Numbers in the tens of thousands, for instance, are widely regarded as exaggeration. But they acknowledge the existence of large displays sufficient to shock contemporary observers. So far, the record suggests a disciplined use of cruelty, targeted, symbolic, staged. Yet another layer complicates the picture: the question of whether these acts were carried out to maximize short-term strategic gains or whether they also reflected internal dynamics of power consolidation at home. Vlad's use of terror did not stop at the border. The same techniques that addressed Ottoman forces were sometimes turned inward against boyars and suspected collaborators. That crossover matters. When acts of public punishment spill over into domestic repression, the calculus of effectiveness becomes morally and politically fraught.
Neighboring powers might see deterrence, but local elites may see a volatile and dangerous ruler. Rumors and pamphlets would later fix such images into the story of Vlad as both defender and despot. It is worth pausing to consider how later memory amplified these practices. The circulation of stories in printed broadsheets and chronicles across Europe fed into a longer cultural memory that would eventually transform a regional ruler into the monstrous figure known widely as Dracula. Bram Stoker's later fiction drew upon a melange of accounts, some grounded in documentation, others in rumor, and some certainly in propaganda. The process of myth-making, however, masks the original strategic logic. It is one thing to read an account that transforms Vlad into an emblem of inhumanity. It is another to recover the motivations and mechanisms that made such acts plausible in the concrete world of 15th century politics and warfare. By the time Mehmed's army reached the Danubian theater, the techniques of terror had been refined into a repertoire. The subsequent encounter between Ottoman forces and the landscape of impalement is where image and strategy converge, and where contemporary sources, Ottoman, Wallachian, and Western, offered their most dramatic, if sometimes conflicting, portrayals. But before turning to those battlefield moments, one must linger on the mechanics and staging of the punishments themselves. How they were prepared, who decided their targets, and how they were intended to function as messages rather than mere acts of vengeance. One practical detail emerges repeatedly in the sources: selection. When prisoners were taken for display, they were not always random. Commanders and envoys were frequently singled out for more prominent placement. Common soldiers might be arranged en masse along a road to create an overwhelming visual rhythm. The selection served two communicative purposes. It personalized the insult to the Ottoman chain of command and, simultaneously, demonstrated the capacity to punish en masse. The arrangement along roads and near gates signaled not only cruelty, but the technical competence to orchestrate a complex display, a competence that, paradoxically, showcased administrative reach rather than barbarism alone. Another technical element concerns duration. Chroniclers note the temporal aspect of the displays. Victims might be left visible for weeks, becoming part of the landscape through which travel and trade occurred. The prolonged exposure multiplied the psychological effect. An army that had to march past again, or a messenger who had to carry news back to Istanbul, would do so under the gaze of these staged signs. The repeated exposure extended the message's life beyond a single moment of shock. Finally, there is the matter of theatrical contrast. Accounts that place Vlad, or his envoys and retinue, in scenes of normal activity, such as meals or court functions within sight of the impaled, intend to convey an additional, chilling message. The ruler is untroubled by the suffering he has orchestrated. Whether or not the most lurid anecdotes of dining among the impaled are literally true, the trope serves a rhetorical function in the sources, and should be read as part of the propaganda ecology surrounding Vlad. It magnifies the psychological impact and clarifies the intended audience, not just the enemy leader, but the empire's conscience. As the pieces of this dark apparatus come into view, apprenticeship in humiliation, symbolic mutilation, staged impalement, and calculated placement, the next question becomes operational. How did these practices play out when Mehmed's forces actually approached? Contemporary narrations converge on a scene of encounter.
The advancing Ottoman columns, the scouts or vanguard catching sight of the first stakes on the distant ridgeline, the spread of word among the ranks, and the reaction at command level. Sources disagree on details. Some assert dramatic pauses and retreats, others record horror combined with fury. What they all agree on is that the spectacle disrupted the expected psychology of conquest. At this juncture, a fuller reconstruction requires parsing chronicle testimony and weighing contradictory claims. Ottoman sources, with their emphasis on the integrity of imperial authority, sometimes spoke of affront and outrage at the sight of impaled captives. Western broadsheets emphasized collapse, troops turning and fleeing or succumbing to nausea. Modern historians, analyzing the logistical realities of 15th century campaigns, suggest a more complex picture. Tactical hesitation, increased caution, slower advances, and recalibration of supply lines and engagement strategies. In short, the displays did not always produce immediate routs, but they altered the operational environment in ways that favored the defender. Before moving into the detailed accounts of specific engagements and the famed moment when Mehmed's army is said to have encountered the forest of stakes, it is important to stress again the role of source criticism. When a Saxon pamphlet exults in the horror supposedly visited upon the Ottoman ranks, it is not merely reporting, it is participating in a politics of representation. When an Ottoman chronicler notes the affront and later describes punitive actions, he is defending the dignity of the Sultan. The careful reader must keep these perspectives in mind. The truth lies not in any single dramatic anecdote, but in the consistent pattern across sources pointing to a deliberate weaponization of cruelty.
And with that caveat front and center, the narrative now approaches the moment that most encapsulates the title's promise. Columns of Ottoman soldiers entering a landscape rearranged by Vlad's punishments, a forest of stakes intended to reach the conscience of an empire. What followed there, the immediate reactions, the choices of commanders, and the eventual movements of armies will be the subject of the next section, where battlefield accounts, command decisions, and the rhetoric of horror intersect to reveal both the effectiveness and the consequences of such measures. The scouts in front of the Ottoman column were the first to notice the unnatural rhythm of the landscape, a repeated verticality along the ridge, a staccato of shapes that at a distance could be mistaken for a strange plantation rather than a field of human suffering. When the report reached the commanders, it was passed with increasing urgency. There are stakes ahead, laid out in rows. There are men on them. What followed, as recorded in chronicles of different sympathies, was less a cinematic, instantaneous rout than a chain of small, cumulative breakdowns in confidence and habit. A commander halts his march to verify. A courier rides back, pale-faced. Men in the vanguard who have seen battle before begin to step more carefully. Rumors spread faster than orders. Accounts diverge on particulars, and it is here that source criticism matters. Western pamphlets, written for an audience hungry for sensational news from the East, describe scenes of mass panic, whole units turning back, officers collapsing at the sight. Ottoman annals, concerned above all with imperial dignity and the maintenance of discipline, record outrage and disgust, but frame reactions in terms of moral injury and command decisions. Modern historians, weighing the logistical realities of 15th century campaigning, supply trains, siege preparations, rigid command structures, reconstruct a more nuanced effect. Hesitation rather than wholesale flight, tactical recalibration rather than immediate collapse. The common thread is nevertheless clear. The spectacle altered the psychology of the march. Mehmed II's position as commander and sovereign complicated how his army processed the spectacle. To be confronted with the bodies and mutilated insignia of one's soldiers is both a tactical problem, how to secure a safe advance, and a symbolic crisis. What does it mean when your standards of honor and the respect due to your commanders are publicly mocked? Some chroniclers claim a visible pall in the Ottoman camp, a shock that required formal consultation among officers. Others record a flush of anger and renewed resolve. Both responses are plausible, both appear in the record. The crucial point is that Vlad intended precisely this duality, to provoke both visceral revulsion and a political dilemma.
Does the Sultan retaliate with overwhelming force, risking greater loss and the further alienation of local populations? Or does he moderate his response to avoid being drawn into a campaign where each day costs not only men but morale? Tactically, several things complicated an immediate Ottoman reaction in Vlad's favor. The Wallachian prince had not relied solely on spectacle. Scorched earth measures had stripped the countryside of easy provisions. Bridges and fords were contested or destroyed. Local guides could not be trusted. Night raids harried supply convoys. Ambushes in narrow defiles made heavy cavalry less useful. The impalements were a multiplier, not the only instrument. They were the sign that the defenders were prepared to make a mile painful and an advance costly. For an invading army that counted on foraging, quartering, and a steady cadence of marches, the knowledge that every road might present an engineered tableau of horror introduced friction into an already difficult campaign. When the decision was taken to probe more forcefully, the Ottomans deployed reconnaissance and punitive detachments. These forays met a Wallachian defense that was flexible and intimate with local terrain. The classic image of a mighty army collapsing at the sight of impaled man simplifies a far more complex interaction of logistics, morale, and political calculation. What the sources do suggest with some consistency is that the empire's commanders paused to consider the costs. That pause, whether brief or prolonged, had strategic consequences. Time favored the defender, who could stretch supply lines and erode the attacker's cohesion. There are episodes in the chronicles where the psychological impact becomes tangible. Men falling sick at the sight. Soldiers openly questioning whether such a place is worth entering. Commanders demanding retribution but hindered by the pragmatic necessities of campaign. Ottoman writers record humiliation and anger. The sight of imperial standards defiled or of officers treated as public spectacle offended notions of honor that underpinned the army's discipline. Western and Central European pamphlets, meanwhile, exaggerated for effect. Mehmet's men supposedly vomited at the sight. Troops fled in droves. Modern scholars treat these images as rhetorical performances. The spectacle was meant to be unbearable, and therefore it worked, to an extent. But what does worked mean in this context? Militarily, the displays achieved a narrow, short-term objective. They imposed hesitation, complicated progress, and bought time. The Ottoman campaign of that year did not grind to an immediate end solely because of the impalements. But the combination of tactics, scorched earth, guerrilla harassment, and the forest of stakes, shifted the cost-benefit calculation. The Ottoman command had to weigh the prestige of crushing a defiant vassal against the material and human expense of a drawn-out enterprise.
For Vlad, whose principality lacked the manpower and resources of his adversary, making the terrain itself hazardous was a rational, if brutal, approach to asymmetric defense. The effectiveness, however, came at a price that would not be paid solely on the battlefield. Internally, the same theater of terror that served as foreign policy also became a tool of governance. The methods applied to Ottoman prisoners, public, humiliating, and staged, were adapted for internal enemies. Boyars suspected of disloyalty found themselves subject to the same apparatus of display and punitive spectacle. Here again, sources must be read with care. Some reports emphasize administrative efficiency and the suppression of treason. Others emphasize brutality and arbitrary cruelty. The overlap is obvious. A method that deters foreign armies can also silence domestic rivals, but at the cost of alienating precisely the people a ruler needs for stability. This internal turn had immediate political consequences. A ruler who rules through fear courts obedience but risks isolating himself from potential allies. The boyars, once cowed, might come to plot rather than openly rebel. Neighbors and potential patrons might reassess the value of supporting a prince whose legitimacy rests in part on terror. The diplomatic aftershocks were felt in courts across Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary and other neighbors observed Vlad's methods with a mixture of grudging admiration for their efficacy and alarm at their escalation.
Pamphleteers and chroniclers in Saxon towns turned these episodes into lurid copy, feeding an image that would circulate long after the facts were settled. Indeed, memory took its own path. The sensational pamphlets that had amplified Vlad's atrocities were not neutral recountings. They were instruments in a marketplace of fears and prejudices. The Saxon broadsheets found a readership eager to believe in monstrous others. Latin chroniclers repeated motifs that resonated with medieval bestiaries of tyrants. Ottoman writers recorded insult and loss in terms that preserved imperial honor. Over time, these varied threads braided into legend. Centuries later, the name Dracula would be reworked into Gothic fiction and then globalized by a novelist who borrowed snippets of reputation while transforming them into supernatural horror. That literary afterlife has obscured and sometimes brutalized the historical reality. A human magistrate using brutal, performative violence as a political instrument. Returning to the immediate aftermath of the Danubian theater, Vlad's success was, in strategic terms, ephemeral. He had demonstrated that terror could win a moment, and that the spectacle could delay or deter a superior force. But it did not secure a durable recognition of sovereignty from the Ottoman center, nor did it create stable alliances among his neighbors. The prince remained precarious.
The same notoriety that made Ottoman envoys fear to cross his borders also made neighboring princes and mercantile communities wary. Accounts of the period note cycles of exile, return, and imprisonment that followed. At times, Vlad enjoyed restoration and favor. At others, he was driven out or detained by more powerful patrons who preferred a less volatile neighbor. Later political collapses and personal reversals are part of the historiography, but require caution in narration. Sources diverge on timing and motive. Where documents are clear, historians cite them. Where they are not, they offer reasoned hypotheses. It is sufficient here to say that the domestic consequences of weaponized cruelty, fear, vengeance, fractious aristocracy contributed to Vlad's eventual downfall. Rule that depends on terror tends to be brittle. It compels compliance but seldom fosters loyalty. When external pressures shift, or when an ally turns, the architecture of fear provides little foundation. There is an ethical dimension that deserves explicit statement. To treat these acts purely as effective military measures risks normalizing their human cost. Even if impalement and public mutilation had a discernible impact on a campaign's outcome, they also inflicted protracted suffering on individuals whose social and political identities were exploited as instruments. Contemporary chroniclers often described the scenes with moral revulsion. Later readers have had to hold both facts and emotions in tension. The historian's task is to show the instrumental logic without aestheticizing suffering, to explain rather than to excuse. This is also where the problem of propaganda is most acute. Saxon pamphlets, Ottoman chronicles, and Wallachian or Hungarian letters each had stakes in how they portrayed events. When multiple independent sources point to a recurring pattern, targeted humiliation, strategic placement of displays, usage of captured commanders as messages, historians give weight to the pattern. When a single sensational account stands alone, skepticism is warranted. The nutrition of legend arises from the mingling of kernels of truth with rhetorical embellishment. A commander captured and publicly displayed becomes, in the retelling, an emblem. The emblem then exceeds the bounds of the original event, accruing motives and meanings that may not have been present at the time. Two concrete examples illustrate this interpretive method. First, the nailing of turbans to heads. Multiple Western pamphlets emphasize this cruelty as a deliberate cultural insult, an attack aimed not only at bodies, but at identity markers conspicuous to Ottoman commanders. Historians accept the plausibility of such symbolic mutilation because it fits a broader pattern of signaling and humiliation. They treat the lurid details in many pamphlets with caution, noting their propagandistic context. Second, the arranged forest of impaled captives along approaches to the capital. Here,
The convergence of sources, both Western and Ottoman, on the existence of dramatic displays gives historians reason to credit the practice while rejecting fantastical numerical claims. Together, these cases show how historians navigate between credulity and dismissal. The moral reckoning continues into the realm of memory. The conversion of an historical actor into a monstrous archetype, a process that fed into early modern pamphlets and later into Gothic fiction, simplified a complex political figure into a narrative of pure monstrousness. While Vlad's acts against Ottoman prisoners were undeniably horrific by contemporary standards, reducing him to a one-dimensional monster obscures context. Geopolitical vulnerability, pressures from internal elites, and the brutal norms of late medieval warfare. That context does not mitigate the cruelty, rather, it situates it so we can understand its rationale and its consequences. As the centuries passed, the story of those acts, the turban nailed to the skull, the rows of impaled men visible from afar, the spectacle arranged to shame emperors, became a cautionary tale about the mechanics of terror. The primary lesson is, paradoxically, both tactical and moral. Terror can be engineered and can function as a weapon, sometimes yielding immediate advantage. Yet, the same mechanics that produce short-term gains corrode political legitimacy, make alliances precarious, and seed reputational consequences that last long after the individual ruler is gone. The history of Vlad's actions against Ottoman prisoners thus reads as a study in instrumentality, of how fear is manufactured, conveyed, and weaponized, and as a moral lesson about the limits of such instruments when they become the foundation of rule. Before closing, a production note. The script should include on-screen. Some contemporary accounts describe severe violence and mutilation. Details vary, and many reports were amplified by partisan chroniclers and pamphleteers. Labeling such images as contested helps viewers differentiate between documented practices and rhetorical exaggeration. Finally, to return to the central image that opened this account, the forest where the trees were people, we should not lose sight of the human cores behind the spectacle. Men taken in war, envoys whose statuses were made into statements, families who would have received news shaped by trauma and humiliation. The historical mechanics matter, but so do the human consequences. The most horrible acts committed against Ottoman prisoners under Vlad's rule were not only instruments of deterrence. They were experiences imposed on individuals who became messages against their will. What then do we take away? That terror is a technology. It can be designed, refined, and embedded into military doctrine. That such technology produces immediate tactical effects does not redeem its human toll.
And that the way we remember these acts, through partisan chronicles, sensational pamphlets, and later literary imaginings, teaches us as much about the cultures that preserved those memories as it does about the events themselves. When a ruler turns suffering into spectacle, the echoes last far beyond the battlefield, shaping reputations, fueling myths, and forcing future generations to ask uncomfortable questions about effectiveness, morality, and memory. If this exploration raised questions for you about the mechanics of terror or the ways history turns cruelty into legend, leave a comment with your thoughts and share this video with someone who loves deep, difficult history. Subscribe for more investigations into the darker tactics of past wars and the human stories behind them. What does it tell us, finally, when the instrument of fear beats an empire's advance? Perhaps that power can be held together by terror for a time, but it rarely builds a stable future. The spectacle may deter an army, but it also deters trust. And in that erasure of trust lies the long-term cost of ruling by cruelty.